The dawn of 401 BC stains the Mesopotamian sands crimson, but this color comes less from the rising sun and more from the blood spilled the day before. On the field near the village of Cunaxa, in the very heart of the Persian Empire, stands an unbreakable wall of 10,000 Greek mercenaries. Their bronze shields and polished helmets catch the first rays of light, creating an illusion of indestructible power. Around them is a dead silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the cawing of crows gathering for a monstrous feast. They are the victors. Their phalanx, a steel hedgehog bristling with spears, has shattered the elite troops of the Persian king, Artaxerxes II. They have done their job with terrifying efficiency, proving to the world that one free Hellenic hoplite is worth 10 enslaved barbarians. But their triumph is as empty and cold as a dead man's eyes. Their employer, the daring and charismatic Cyrus the Younger, a contender for the Persian throne, lies somewhere on this same field with a javelin in his temple. His death, in the heat of his own reckless charge, has turned their brilliant tactical victory into a strategic disaster of epic proportions. They are a perfect sword, left without a hand to wield it. They are 1,500 kilometers from the nearest Greek city, trapped deep within the most powerful and hostile empire of the known world. They have no maps, no guides, no objective, and no idea what to do next. In this very moment, the greatest paradox in military history is born. An absolute victory on the battlefield has become the starting point for a descent into the abyss of despair, the beginning of a journey where survival itself seemed an impossible audacity. It is here, among the corpses and illusions, that the main question arises, one that will echo through the ages. How did this handful of men, betrayed, leaderless, and lost, not only survive, but turn their retreat into a legend of the unyielding human spirit? To understand the scale of the 10,000's tragedy, one must look at the world at the end of the 5th century BC. It was an era of great upheaval, when old empires were cracking at the seams and new powers were just finding their place under the sun. Greece, the cradle of democracy and philosophy, was wounded and exhausted by the recent Peloponnesian War, which had lasted for nearly 3 decades. This fratricidal conflict between Athens and Sparta left behind not only ruined cities and scorched fields, but an entire generation of men who knew nothing but how to fight. Thousands of professional hoplite soldiers, veterans of countless battles, found themselves unemployed. They were too proud to work the fields and too experienced to sit idle. For them, mercenary work became the only way to feed themselves and their families, the only opportunity to apply their deadly skills. They became combustible material, a ready army waiting for whoever would pay the most and promise the richest plunder. At the other end of the known world, the civilized world, lay the Achaemenid Persian Empire. On maps, it looked like an indestructible colossus, stretching from the Aegean Sea to India. But behind the facade of limitless power and unimaginable wealth hid a deep internal rot. The empire was a patchwork of dozens of conquered peoples, each hating their masters and waiting for an opportunity to rebel. Most importantly, the heart of the empire, the royal court at Susa, was a nest of vipers, where palace intrigues, poisonings, and dynastic feuds were the norm of political life. It was at this point that 2 forces converged, the surplus of military energy in Greece and the power vacuum in Persia. Cyrus the Younger, the ambitious brother of King Artaxerxes, decided to use this Greek combustible material to seize the throne. He put out the call, and thousands of Greeks, drawn by promises of immense wealth, flocked to Asia Minor. They became pawns in the great game of Persian princes, not yet suspecting that their quest for gold would turn into an odyssey of survival that would forever change the world's understanding of war and human potential. At the center of this historical storm is a figure who, at first glance, seems utterly unsuited for the role that fate had in store for him. Xenophon, son of Grillus from the Athenian deme of Erchia, was neither a Spartan king nor a celebrated strategist. He was a product of Athens' golden age, an aristocrat by birth and an intellectual by vocation. His youth was spent not in military camps, but in the shadow of the Athenian agora, where he eagerly absorbed the wisdom of one of the greatest minds in human history, Socrates. It was Socrates who taught him the most important thing: the art of dialectic, the ability to ask the right questions, to separate truth from falsehood, and to persuade people with the power of logic and words. This was an education not for a soldier, but for a philosopher and a citizen. His character was forged in the fire of intellectual debates, not in the crucible of battle. Moreover, his past was darkened by the greatest trauma for any Athenian of his generation: the crushing defeat in the Peloponnesian War and the subsequent humiliating rule of the 30 Tyrants. Then, like a devastating blow, came the trial and execution of Socrates in 399 BC. For Xenophon, this was not just a personal tragedy, but a symbol of the deep crisis of Athenian democracy, which had destroyed its finest citizen. Disenchanted with politics, suffocated by the atmosphere of intrigue and mutual accusations in his native city, he was looking for a way out. He was searching for something more, for action, for meaning, for a great deed that could drown out the pain of his losses and give him a new purpose in life. He was a man of the word, thrown into a world that seemed to demand only the sword. He did not yet know that his main weapon, honed in conversations with his teacher, would prove far more deadly and life-saving than thousands of spears, and that it would be he, the philosopher, who was destined to become the savior of the greatest mercenary army of his time. The call of the East came to Xenophon through his old friend, Proxenus, a Boeotian already in the service of Cyrus the Younger. Proxenus's letter was full of tempting promises. He described Cyrus not just as a generous employer, but as a future great king, a friend to all Hellenes, who would shower his comrades in arms with unimaginable wealth and honors. For Xenophon, who was at a spiritual and professional dead end in Athens, this offer was like a breath of fresh air. However, raised by Socrates in a spirit of caution and analysis, he did not rush headlong into the venture. First, he went to his teacher for advice. Socrates, suspecting that serving a Persian prince could be seen in Athens as treason, since Persia was an eternal enemy, advised Xenophon to turn to the gods and consult the Delphic oracle. Xenophon did so, but as his own chronicles attest, he was cunning. Instead of asking if he should go on the campaign at all, he phrased the question differently. To which gods should I sacrifice, so that my journey may be successful and I may return home safely? The oracle gave him an answer, and Xenophon, returning to Athens, presented it to Socrates. His teacher reproached him for his slyness, for having already made his decision and merely seeking divine approval, but nevertheless advised him to follow the god's instructions. This episode reveals Xenophon's complex nature. He was not a blind instrument of fate. He was a man trying to reconcile his ambitions with the voice of reason and piety, while using the full arsenal of sophistic tricks he had learned in Athens. His decision to join Cyrus was not an act of faith in prophecy, but a conscious, calculated risk, driven by a thirst for adventure, a desire to escape a stifling reality, and perhaps a subconscious urge to find material for the great story he felt he had the power to write. He was heading east, not as a simple mercenary, but as an explorer of human nature under extreme conditions. In the first months of the campaign, Xenophon held no command role. He joined the expedition without a specific position, more as a guest and friend of Proxenus. This observer status gave him a unique opportunity that other commanders, busy with routine matters of discipline and supply, lacked. He could move freely through the camp, talk with soldiers from different Greek city-states, Spartans, Arcadians, Thebans, and study their dialects, customs, and prejudices. He watched as this diverse mass of veterans, adventurers, and exiles gradually transformed into a single military organism, bound by a common goal: wealth. He meticulously recorded everything in his campaign journals: the distance traveled, the features of the landscape, the customs of the local tribes through whose lands they passed. He analyzed the supply system of the massive army and the methods of maintaining discipline used by the supreme commander of the Greek contingent, the stern Spartan Clearchus. For Xenophon, this was not just a journey, but an intensive course in field anthropology, military strategy, and political psychology. He observed Cyrus, noting his charisma, his ability to treat the Greeks as equals, his generosity, and his ruthlessness. He saw how the Persian prince skillfully manipulated his mercenaries, hiding the true purpose of the campaign from them. This position as a detached analyst allowed him to understand the deep structure and psychology of a mercenary army. He realized that its main strength was the supreme professionalism of each warrior, and its main weakness was the lack of a unifying idea beyond money. The soldiers were loyal not to Cyrus or to Greece, but only to their commanders and their comrades, and only as long as they were paid. This period of passive but thoughtful observation became for Xenophon an invaluable forge of character, his unofficial military academy. He learned not from maps and diagrams, but from the living, breathing, and dangerous organism of the army, not yet knowing that very soon he would have to take command of this organism to save it from certain doom. The journey into the heart of Asia was marked by the first serious test, which became an important lesson for the Greeks, and for Xenophon in particular. When hiring the army, Cyrus the Younger had announced that he was preparing a campaign against the warlike mountain tribe of the Pisidians in Asia Minor. This was a plausible and relatively safe objective that did not raise major concerns among the Greeks. However, as the army pushed further and further east, past Pisidia, and deep into the territory directly controlled by King Artaxerxes, unease began to grow among the soldiers. Experienced veterans understood that a war against mountain tribesmen did not require such a massive army and an impressive baggage train. Rumors and speculation multiplied, and finally, at Tarsus, on the border of Cilicia, the truth came out. The Greeks realized they were being led not against some wild tribes, but against the great king, the legitimate ruler of the Persian Empire. This meant not just a military campaign, but a rebellion, an act of treason, participation in a civil war. The army mutinied. The soldiers refused to go any further, accusing their commanders and Cyrus of deception. They felt betrayed and dragged into a deadly venture they had not signed up for. At this critical moment, the Spartan Clearchus stepped forward. He neither threatened nor pandered. He used all his authority and cunning. First, he pretended to fully support the soldiers and refused to lead them on, thus winning their trust. Then, in a series of masterfully constructed speeches, he gradually convinced them that turning back was now too late and dangerous, while moving forward with Cyrus was profitable, promising them a huge increase in pay. Xenophon watched this drama unfold before his eyes and drew his conclusions. He saw how fragile trust is in a mercenary army and how easily it can be lost. He saw that brute force doesn't work here, and that power rests on authority, rhetoric, and, most importantly, the promise of profit. He remembered this lesson. To lead these men, you must understand their psychology, speak their language, and appeal to their interests. It was his first real look at the mechanics of power in a world of swords and gold. Behind the external events and twists of the campaign lay Xenophon's deep, personal motivation, which set him apart from all the other participants in this venture. While the common soldiers dreamed of gold to buy a farm in Arcadia, and commanders like Clearchus craved power and glory, Xenophon was driven by a different, more subtle and powerful force. He was a man of logos, a Greek concept that means word, reason, and meaning all at once. As a student of Socrates, he believed that man's greatest purpose was to know and comprehend the world, to give an ordered and understandable form to chaotic reality. His inner demon, his secret ambition, was not to conquer a kingdom or amass treasures, but to witness great events and record them for posterity. He carried within him a thirst for immortality, not the kind won on the battlefield, but the kind bestowed by history. In his campaign bag, a stylus and waxed tablets were no less important than a sword. Every day he recorded the distance traveled, described the customs of peoples, analyzed tactical decisions, and, most importantly, studied human characters as they were revealed under extreme conditions. He saw this campaign not just as a military operation, but as a grand drama with heroes, villains, moments of triumph, and moments of despair. Even then, perhaps subconsciously, he was trying on the role of the future chronicler of this epic. This internal focus on comprehending and recording events gave him a unique psychological detachment. Even in the most terrifying moments, he remained not only a participant, but also an observer, a historian who understood that his personal sufferings and fears were merely material for a future great narrative. It was this thirst to turn action into words, events into history, that would become the backbone that would not let him break when everything collapsed. His true goal was not just to return home, but to bring back a story that would make him and his comrades immortal. The culmination of Cyrus the Younger's audacious plan and the starting point of the Greeks' great odyssey was the Battle of Cunaxa, which took place in 401 BC. Here, on a dusty plain near Babylon, two armies and two destinies clashed. On one side was the huge multinational army of King Artaxerxes, estimated by various sources to number from several 100,000 to nearly 1,000,000 warriors, including the famous Persian cavalry and war chariots. On the other was the compact but professional army of the rebel Cyrus, the core of which was those same 10,000 Greek hoplites under the command of Clearchus. The Greeks took the right honorary flank, and when the signal for attack sounded, they showed the entire East what a Hellenic phalanx was. Moving as a single living organism, to the sound of the paean, their battle hymn, they advanced slowly and relentlessly upon the enemy. The Persians, accustomed to a different kind of warfare, one of maneuver, archery, and swift cavalry raids, were paralyzed with terror at the sight of this approaching wall of shields and spears. Their lines wavered and broke even before hand-to-hand combat began. The left wing of Artaxerxes' army was completely crushed and sent into a panicked retreat. From a tactical point of view, it was an absolute, devastating triumph. The Greeks lost almost no men and completed their task brilliantly. However, while the Hellenes were celebrating victory on the right flank, a tragedy was unfolding in the center. Cyrus, spotting his rival brother Artaxerxes in the thick of the battle, blinded by hatred and the lust for power, made a fatal mistake. At the head of his small band of bodyguards, he launched a suicidal charge, trying to kill the king himself. He managed to break through, and even wound his brother. But in the next moment, he was surrounded and fell, pierced by a javelin. With his death, the entire political and military structure of the campaign collapsed in an instant. The goal for which the Greeks had crossed half the world ceased to exist. Their victory in battle had become meaningless. They were left alone, victors on a patch of land, surrounded by a hostile empire whose legitimate ruler they had just tried to overthrow. The catastrophic triumph at Cunaxa became the perfect setup for a drama in which the main hero would no longer be a prince, but an entire army fighting for its right to live. The next morning brought not the elation of victors, but a chilling awareness of reality. The Greeks awoke in their camp, still ready for battle, expecting messengers from Cyrus with orders and thanks. But the camp of their Persian allies was empty. Cyrus's Asian troops, upon learning of his death, had scattered during the night. All around, as far as the eye could see, stretched an endless plain, and on the horizon, huge clouds of dust were already rising from Artaxerxes' army as it regrouped after the previous day's defeat. The silence, broken only by the wind, was more ominous than any battle cry. And then, the first messengers finally arrived, not with congratulations, but with terrible news. Cyrus was dead. For the Greeks, this news was like a bolt from the blue. They were mercenaries, and the dead don't pay. Their entire venture, all their hopes for wealth and glory, had turned to dust. But that was only half the problem. This was followed by the realization of their monstrous situation. They were not just unemployed soldiers, they were declared enemies of the Persian state. They were in its very heart, thousands of kilometers from home, without food, without guides, without a single ally. Around them was a scorched earth and the king's army thirsting for revenge. All paths of retreat seemed cut off. It was a moment of absolute existential terror. The army's psychological state was on the verge of collapse. The soldiers, who only yesterday had felt like invincible demigods, were now seized with despair. They gathered in groups, talking quietly, their faces grim. They looked to their commanders, waiting for an answer to the unspoken question, what now? But the commanders were also at a loss. In that moment, at that point of reset, when all former hierarchy and goals had lost their meaning, the army transformed from a formidable fighting force into a crowd of frightened and lost men. Their survival now depended on whether a force could be found to turn this primal fear into organized resistance. In this atmosphere of universal confusion and fear, a ray of hope appeared, which turned out to be a deadly trap. Tissaphernes, one of Artaxerxes' chief satraps and generals, arrived to meet with the Greeks. He came not with an ultimatum, but with proposals of peace. Expressing his admiration for the Greeks' valor, he stated that the king, appreciating their courage, was prepared to show mercy. Tissaphernes offered the Greeks a truce. They were to swear an oath not to plunder the king's lands, and he, in turn, would provide them with provisions and guides who would lead them by a safe route out of the empire. For the exhausted and demoralized army, this offer seemed like salvation. After long deliberations and debates, the Greek commanders, led by Clearchus, accepted the proposal. They were professional warriors and understood that fighting their way through all of Persia was suicide. The idea of a peaceful exit was too tempting. Accompanied by Persian troops, the army moved north. For several weeks, everything went smoothly. The Persians did indeed supply them with food. However, tension was building. The Greeks and Persians camped on opposite banks of a river, watching each other with mistrust. Finally, Tissaphernes, citing the need to finalize all formalities and seal the treaty, invited all the senior Greek commanders, the 5 generals, including Clearchus, and 20 company commanders, to his tent for a feast. Despite some suspicions, The Greek leaders, bound by their word and the traditions of hospitality, accepted the invitation. It was a fatal mistake. As soon as they entered the Persian camp, they were seized. The generals were immediately put in chains and sent to the king in Babylon, where they were beheaded after being tortured. The company commanders were slaughtered on the spot. The common soldiers, remaining in the Greek camp, watched in horror as Persian cavalry galloped across the plain, killing any Greeks who had wandered off alone for wood or fodder. The army of the 10,000 had been decapitated. Tissaphernes' cunning and merciless blow was perfectly calculated. Deprived of all its leaders, the army was supposed to fall into a panic and become easy prey. It was the moment of absolute darkness. That night, a dead, oppressive silence fell over the Greek camp. The soldiers, realizing the monstrous betrayal, were paralyzed with horror and grief. They didn't light fires, they didn't eat dinner, and many didn't even lie down to sleep, awaiting the inevitable morning attack by the Persians that was meant to annihilate them all. It seemed that the story of the 10,000 had come to an inglorious end. It was on this night, the darkest in the history of the campaign, that fate found its hero. Xenophon, like everyone else, was despondent and could not sleep. But towards morning, he finally dozed off and had a vivid, symbolic dream. He saw the heavens open up, and a dazzling bolt of lightning, sent by Zeus, struck his father's house, and everything around was illuminated by an unbearable light. Waking in a cold sweat, he immediately began to analyze his dream, as Socrates had taught him. On the one hand, the dream could portend doom. But on the other hand, a light in the darkness could also be a sign of salvation, a divine call to action. He chose the second interpretation. He realized that the gods do not send salvation to the passive and despairing. The lightning was not a sentence, but a spur. At that moment, a turning point occurred within him. The philosopher-observer died. The leader was born. He understood that there was nothing and no one left to wait for. Salvation was in their own hands. He got up, found, and woke the surviving junior commanders, the captains and officers who were still alive. Gathering them together, he delivered his first great speech. It was not the speech of a professional military commander, but the fiery appeal of an intellectual. He gave no tactical advice. He appealed to their reason, their pride, their honor. He asked them, "What are we waiting for? For the king to come and destroy us? Shall we, Hellenes, born to be free, submit to slavery or a shameful death?" With the force of his logic and passion, he ignited a spark of hope and the will to resist in these desperate men. He made them believe that even in this hopeless situation, they had a chance. That night became the birthplace of the new Xenophon and, consequently, the point of rebirth for the entire army. Xenophon's next step, immediately following his fateful nighttime speech, was an act unprecedented in the military practice of the time and absolutely brilliant from a psychological standpoint. Instead of declaring himself the new dictator or trying to seize power by force of his authority, he initiated general elections. At dawn, at his call, a general assembly of the entire army was convened. Before the faces of 10,000 desperate but now slightly heartened soldiers, Xenophon and the other officers he had rallied during the night proposed to immediately elect new commanders to replace those who had been treacherously murdered. This decision transformed the amorphous and panicking crowd of mercenaries into something entirely new, a marching republic or an armed democracy. Every hoplite, from a simple Arcadian shepherd to a noble Spartan, was given the right to vote. They themselves, by direct ballot, chose their new generals, including Xenophon, new company commanders, and captains. This democratic process had a colossal psychological impact. First, it immediately restored the broken command structure, giving the army new leaders, this time vested with the trust of the entire collective. Second, it returned to each soldier a sense of dignity and participation. This was no longer Cyrus's or Clearchus's army. It was their army. Every warrior became not an object of orders, but a subject of decision-making, a citizen of this unique mobile polis that carried the laws and traditions of Greek freedom in its baggage train. The most important questions about the route, battle tactics, the punishment of offenders were now brought before the General Assembly. Xenophon, as an orator and intellectual, found the perfect platform for his talents. He could directly address the people, persuade, argue, and prove his point. The army, born from the ashes of betrayal, became a living embodiment of the Greek ideals of freedom and self-government. It was this internal cohesion, this sense of a common cause, and the personal responsibility of each for the fate of all, that became the cement that bound the army together and allowed it to withstand all subsequent trials. Realizing that there would be no peaceful retreat and that a war for survival lay ahead, Xenophon and the newly elected commanders immediately began a radical reorganization of the army. They understood that the classic hoplite phalanx tactic, perfect for a pitched battle on a plain, was completely useless in their new circumstances. Their main enemy was now not heavy infantry, but the swift units of Persian cavalry and horse archers under the command of that same Tissaphernes. The Persians did not engage in close combat, where the Greeks had an undeniable advantage. Instead, they circled at a safe distance, showering the slow-moving column with clouds of arrows, exhausting the army and giving it no rest. To counter this threat, immediate and unconventional solutions were required. First, Xenophon proposed creating their own units of light infantry. Among the Greeks were about 200 archers from Crete and several hundred slingers from Rhodes. They were immediately organized into a separate unit. The Rhodian slingers proved to be a real treasure. They could hurl their lead bullets twice as far as the Persian archers could shoot their arrows, which allowed them to keep the enemy at a respectful distance. Second, a small but desperately needed cavalry was created. A troop of 50 horsemen was assembled from baggage and officers' horses, becoming the eyes and ears of the army, conducting reconnaissance and driving off enemy riders. The most important innovation, however, was the transformation of the marching formation. The army learned to form a Pelagian ortheion, a mobile square or rectangle. Inside this living bastion of shields and spears were the baggage train, pack animals, and the wounded. This formation allowed them to repel attacks from any direction without halting their movement. The army turned into a slow-crawling, armored tortoise on enemy land, capable of snapping back in all directions. This rapid and intelligent adaptation to new conditions, this rejection of dogma and outdated tactics in favor of efficiency, became one of the key factors that answered the question how. They ceased to be just a phalanx and became a multifunctional, self-sufficient combat unit. The first weeks after the execution of the commanders were a baptism by fire for the renewed army. Moving north along the Tigris River, the Greeks immediately felt the full force of the Persian military machine, controlled by the vengeful Tissaphernes. Every day became a grueling struggle for survival. At dawn, clouds of dust would appear on the horizon, the Persian cavalry approaching. They did not attack head-on, preferring a strategy of attrition. Hundreds of horse archers circled the Greek square, showering it with arrows. They then set fire to the steppe and villages in the Greeks' path, employing a scorched earth policy to deprive them of food and fodder. Every halt, every attempt to find water, turned into a separate military operation. The Greeks suffered losses, but they did not surrender. The new tactical units created by Xenophon immediately went into action. The Rhodian slingers, with their long-range shots, forced the Persian horsemen to keep their distance. The small cavalry detachment made daring sorties, scattering the skirmishers and giving the main column a respite. Xenophon and the other commanders were everywhere. They directed the defense, encouraged the soldiers, and tended to the wounded. It was a hellish school that forged the new army in the shortest possible time. The soldiers learned to act in concert, to trust their new commanders, and to hate the enemy with a fierce passion. The psychological pressure was immense. The constant tension, the whistle of arrows overhead, the sight of falling comrades, the meager rations, all of this could have broken anyone. But the Greeks held firm. This first stage of the retreat through the scorching Mesopotamian plain under the relentless attacks of Tissaphernes proved the viability of the army's new organization and, more importantly, strengthened the soldiers' belief that they could resist and win even in the most desperate circumstances. They paid for this lesson with blood, but it was vital for the even more terrible trials that lay ahead. After an exhausting march across the plains of Mesopotamia, the Greeks finally reached the foothills of Armenia. Here they had a choice to make: continue north on relatively flat terrain, where Tissaphernes could still pursue them, or turn northwest into the mountains, into the land of the Carduchians, modern-day Kurdistan. Local guides, horrified, advised them against the second option. The Carduchians were a wild, warlike, and independent people whom even the mighty Persian king could not subdue. They answered to no one and killed any stranger who set foot on their land. But it was precisely this that appealed to the Greek commanders. In the mountains, the Persian cavalry, their main enemy, would be useless. They decided it was better to fight men, however fierce, than a ghostly and elusive cavalry. They chose the mountains and immediately entered hell. The warfare here was completely different. It was not about maneuver or tactics, but a primal struggle for survival in a vertical world. The Carduchians did not form battle lines. They set ambushes in narrow gorges, hurled rocks and boulders down on the Greeks' heads from the cliffs, and showered them with arrows from inaccessible heights. Every pass had to be taken by storm, with loss of life. They could only move during the day, and at night they had to set up defenses on some peak, suffering from the cold and constant attacks. This nightmarish crossing lasted for 7 days. The Greeks suffered greater losses than during the entire pursuit by Tissaphernes. The baggage train had to be abandoned, and many of the wounded perished. It was a brutal, guerrilla war for which they were unprepared. But here, too, the genius of Xenophon and his comrades shone through. They divided the army into smaller, more mobile units that could move faster through the mountains. They learned to storm heights using flanking maneuvers and feigned attacks. Xenophon, risking his life, personally led the rearguard, repelling the fiercest attacks and saving the wounded. This passage through the land of the Carduchians became the army's harshest test of endurance. They emerged from these mountains depleted and exhausted, but with new, invaluable experience. They had learned to fight in any conditions and realized that there was no obstacle they could not overcome. Having barely escaped the mountain hell of Carduchia, the Greeks faced a new, even more ruthless and impartial enemy. They entered the Armenian highlands, and winter fell upon them. This was not a mild Greek winter, but a harsh continental one, with piercing winds and deep snow. For men dressed in light tunics and sandals, accustomed to the Mediterranean climate, it was a catastrophe. The snow fell relentlessly, covering the roads and hiding treacherous pits and ravines. Soon it was up to the soldiers' waists, turning every step into a torturous effort. The piercing north wind, as the chronicles tell, burned and froze everything it touched. Mass frostbite began. Soldiers lost fingers and toes and were blinded by the bright glare of the snow. Hunger became their constant companion. Villages were few, and those they encountered were either abandoned by their inhabitants or buried in snow. The army had to eat the meat of fallen pack animals, and when that ran out, despair set in. Morale plummeted to its lowest point. Men began to freeze to death right at the resting spots. A soldier who sat down to rest in the snow would fall into apathy, fall asleep, and never wake up. At this critical moment, Xenophon proved himself not only as a strategist, but as a great psychologist and leader. He did not sit back in the warmth. He walked on foot with the common soldiers, chopped wood, helped set up tents, and personally roused and forced those who wanted to give up and freeze to be on their feet. There are accounts of how, seeing soldiers sitting huddled from the cold, he would approach them, take an axe, and start chopping wood, shaming them by his example. He organized parties to go ahead and find shelter and food. He forced people to move, to talk, to act, not allowing them to succumb to the deadly apathy. The battle with the Armenian winter was perhaps the most difficult trial for the 10,000. They were fighting not against Persians or Carduchians, but against nature itself, against primal cold and hunger. And they won this battle not so much by force of arms, but by the strength of spirit that their Athenian commander sustained in them. Throughout this unimaginable journey, across deserts, mountains, and snows, Xenophon's main weapon was not the sword or the spear, but his voice. The ability to speak, persuade, and inspire, which he learned from Socrates in the Athenian agora, proved to be more valuable in these extreme conditions than any tactical maneuver. The army, having become a marching republic, required constant communication and explanation. Every important decision had to be made and approved at a general assembly. And here, Xenophon was second to none. His speeches, which he later meticulously recorded in the Anabasis, are true masterpieces of military and political rhetoric. He never spoke to the soldiers as subordinates. He addressed them as equals, as fellow citizens and comrades in misfortune. When the army fell into despair, he reminded them of their Hellenic heritage, that they were descendants of the heroes who fought at Marathon and Salamis, and that the shame of slavery or an inglorious death was worse than death itself. When it was necessary to storm an impregnable pass, he painted vivid pictures of returning home to their wives and children, saying that only this final push separated them from salvation. When disputes and arguments broke out in the army, he appealed to their reason, logically proving that their strength lay only in unity, and that individually they would all perish. He could be versatile. He could praise the brave in a way that made them feel invincible, and he could shame the cowards and lazy so that they wanted to sink into the ground. He used the entire arsenal of rhetorical devices, rhetorical questions, vivid metaphors, historical examples, even jokes to lighten the mood. He controlled this 10,000-strong mass of armed, desperate, and often unruly men, not so much by the force of command, but by the power of persuasion. He proved that logos, the word, can be a most powerful weapon, capable of turning a mob into a brotherhood, fear into fury, and despair into an unshakable will to live. It was this gift of oratory, honed in peaceful Athens, that allowed the philosopher Xenophon to become the heart and mind of an army waging its hopeless war. Despite all the efforts of Xenophon and the other commanders, maintaining unity in an army pushed to the limits of human endurance was incredibly difficult. The constant companions of the march, hunger, cold, fatigue, and the fear of death, created fertile ground for internal conflicts, mutinies, and discord. The unity forged in the face of the common Persian threat began to crack as soon as the enemy disappeared from view. Outbursts of discontent occurred regularly. The soldiers, exhausted by the endless journey, began to grumble. They accused their commanders, and Xenophon in particular, of leading them the wrong way, of seeking personal glory at the risk of their lives. Several times it came to open mutiny. Once, during a particularly difficult crossing, a group of soldiers accused Xenophon of riding a horse while they trudged through the snow on foot. Xenophon immediately dismounted, took a shield from one of the most tired hoplites, and walked at the very front, proving that he shared the same hardships as everyone else. Another time, when the army was suffering from hunger, a riot broke out, and Xenophon was nearly stoned. He had to call an emergency assembly and use all his eloquence to calm the crowd, explaining that the commanders were suffering from deprivation no less than the rank and file. There were also frictions between the commanders themselves, especially between the Athenian Xenophon and the Spartan Chrysippus, who was formally the senior in rank. They often argued about tactics and the route, reflecting the eternal rivalry between their home cities. Xenophon had to constantly navigate, persuade, compromise, and sometimes show toughness. He established a field court that dealt with offenses and passed sentences, up to and including the death penalty, maintaining discipline not only with persuasion, but with the force of law, accepted by the entire army. This constant struggle with internal demons, with despair, mistrust, and selfishness, was no less important and complex than the battles with external enemies. Xenophon had to be not only a general, but also a diplomat, a judge, and a psychotherapist for 10,000 tormented souls. Besides his strategic vision and oratorical talent, Xenophon possessed another quality that repeatedly saved the army: tactical ingenuity. In situations where there was no time for long deliberation, and any mistake could be the last, he demonstrated an astonishing ability to find unconventional and effective solutions. The story of the Anabasis is full of examples of his tactical masterpieces, born in seemingly hopeless situations. One of the most striking episodes is the crossing of the wide and turbulent Tigris River. The enemy was already waiting for the Greeks on the other side. Building a bridge was impossible. Then Xenophon, noticing that the locals used inflated leather skins to cross, ordered his soldiers to do the same. They slaughtered several oxen, goats, and sheep from the baggage train, inflated their hides, and using them as floats, built makeshift rafts on which they successfully ferried the army to the other side, leaving the stunned enemy behind. Another time, in the mountains of Carduccia, a narrow pass blocked the Greeks' path, its summit occupied by elite enemy forces. A frontal assault would have been suicide. So Xenophon selected a detachment of volunteers and, under the cover of night, led them on a detour along barely visible trails shown to him by a prisoner. While the main army simulated preparations for a frontal attack, Xenophon's detachment suddenly struck the enemy from the rear, causing panic and putting them to flight. He masterfully used disinformation and military ruses. Before one battle, he ordered far more campfires to be lit at night than were necessary, creating the impression that the Greeks were much more numerous. And during the day, he arranged the army in several lines, ordering the rear ranks to constantly move, to create the illusion of great depth. Each such decision was not just a display of intelligence, but the result of a deep analysis of the situation, an understanding of the enemy's psychology, and the ability to use any available means. It was this flexibility of mind, the ability to think outside the box and turn weaknesses into strengths, that allowed Xenophon to lead his army through dozens of deadly traps. The key to survival on this endless march was not just physical health, but psychological resilience. Xenophon understood better than anyone that the most important battle was being fought not on the fields of war, but in the minds and hearts of his soldiers. Despair, apathy, and the loss of hope were far more terrifying enemies than Persian arrows and Kurdish javelins. Therefore, he waged a relentless war for the morale of his army, using a whole arsenal of psychological techniques. He understood that people need not only bread, but also spectacle, not only rest, but also a sense of purpose. He turned the maintenance of hope into a true science. First, he introduced strict discipline, but not a blind, punitive one, but a conscious one. Any infraction was punished, but any feat of bravery was publicly rewarded. After a successful battle or a difficult march, he would hold general assemblies, where he would name the heroes, praise them, and give them rewards from the meager common stores. This created healthy competition and gave the soldiers a sense that their sacrifices were not in vain. Second, as soon as there was the slightest respite, he organized athletic competitions, just like the Olympic Games in Greece. The soldiers competed in running, wrestling, and discus throwing. These improvised games not only helped maintain physical fitness, but more importantly, returned them to the familiar world of Hellenic culture, reminding them that they were not just a savage horde, but bearers of a great civilization. He made them celebrate the smallest successes: a successful hunt, the capture of a small baggage train, a successful river crossing. These small victories, duly noted, added up to an overall feeling that they were not just fleeing, but winning. He constantly spoke of the future, painting pictures of their return, making the soldiers live not only in the horrors of today, but in the dream of tomorrow. In this way, Xenophon managed the most valuable resource of his army: hope, not allowing its fire to be extinguished by the icy winds of despair. After months of inhuman suffering, after deserts, mountains, and snows, the moment arrived that became the emotional climax of the entire march and has forever been etched in the annals of world history. The army, having fought its way through the lands of warlike tribes, was climbing another mountain pass. Xenophon, as usual, was in the rear guard, repelling the attacks of pursuers. Suddenly, he heard an unusual noise growing at the head of the column, which had already reached the summit. At first, he thought the vanguard was under attack. The noise grew louder and louder, and he began to hear distinct shouts. He spurred his horse and, with his detachment, galloped forward, ready for a fight. When he reached the summit, an incredible sight met his eyes. The soldiers standing on the ridge were not fighting. They were crying, hugging each other, falling to their knees, pointing their fingers somewhere in the distance. Xenophon pushed through the crowd and looked where everyone was looking. Ahead, beyond a series of hills, on the horizon, lay a dark, endless blue line. It was the sea. The Black Sea, which the Greeks called the Euxine Pontus. For them, a nation of seafarers, the sea was synonymous with home. It was the border of the Greek world, beyond which lay civilization, safety, their homeland. And then, from the entire army, from thousands of throats, a single cry erupted, one that would become legendary: Thalata, Thalata, the sea, the sea. This cry was the quintessence of everything they had endured. It held the relief after unimaginable suffering, the joy of salvation, and the pride in their accomplishment. Battle-hardened veterans who knew no tears wept like children. They built a huge mound of stones on the mountaintop, their improvised altar, and offered sacrifices of thanks to the gods. In that moment, they ceased to be just a mercenary army. They became a brotherhood, bound by shared suffering and a shared triumph. They were not home yet. Many more trials awaited them. But psychologically, their odyssey was over. They had seen the light at the end of the tunnel. They had proven to themselves and to the world that the impossible was possible. The euphoria of seeing the sea quickly gave way to harsh reality. Upon reaching the coast, the army arrived at the first Greek colony, Trapezus. The soldiers expected to be welcomed as heroes, as fellow Hellenes who had accomplished an unparalleled feat. They dreamed of a warm reception, food, rest, and most importantly, ships that would take them home. However, reality turned out to be far more prosaic and harsh. The inhabitants of Trapezus and other Greek cities on the Black Sea coast met the 10,000 with great apprehension and mistrust. They certainly admired their feat, but at the same time, they saw before them a huge, battle-hardened, hungry, and essentially uncontrollable army. For small colonies living on trade and a fragile peace with the surrounding barbarian tribes, the appearance of such a force was more of a threat than a joy. They feared the mercenaries would start pillaging them, or, even worse, decide to stay and seize power. Therefore, the help they offered was very limited. They opened a market where the soldiers could buy provisions for those who still had money. But they refused to allow the entire army within the city walls, forcing them to camp outside. Providing ships for 10,000 men was out of the question. The colonies simply did not have such a large fleet. This was a bitter disappointment for many of the soldiers. They, who had survived in the heart of the Persian Empire, felt like strangers and unwanted guests on the threshold of their own Hellenic world. Conflicts began. Hungry soldiers raided nearby villages for food, which led to armed clashes with the local inhabitants, including fellow Greek colonists. The paradox of the situation was that the most severe betrayals and disappointments awaited the army not from their barbarian enemies, but from their own countrymen. This experience became another harsh lesson for Xenophon and his soldiers about human nature, and how the bonds of blood and common culture often give way to fear and self-interest. Reaching the main intermediate goal, the sea, had an unexpected and almost destructive side effect. As long as the army was fighting for survival deep in enemy territory, it had one common goal that held it together. But as soon as that goal was achieved, the centrifugal forces that had been dormant within this diverse collective burst forth with new vigor. The unity forged in the deserts and mountains began to crack at the seams. The army split into several factions, each with its own idea of what to do next. Some, the most exhausted, wanted to get to Greece as quickly as possible, no matter the cost. Others, feeling their strength, proposed founding a new colony right there on the coast and taking land and wealth by force. Still others, the most unruly, simply wanted to plunder and profit without thinking of the consequences. Xenophon, who dreamed of keeping the army united and bringing it home with honor, found himself in a very difficult position. His authority was seriously tested. The soldiers, who just yesterday had obeyed him without question, now argued with him at assemblies, accusing him of new ambitious plans. At one point, the army even split into 3 parts that tried to act independently, but after suffering losses in skirmishes with local tribes, they were forced to reunite. Xenophon had to use all his powers of persuasion to prevent a final collapse. He argued that only together did they represent a force, while separately they would become easy prey. With great difficulty, he managed to restrain the army from anarchy and looting, knowing that this would completely ruin their reputation and deprive them of their last hope for help from the Greek cities. This period was perhaps the most psychologically difficult for Xenophon. He had won the war against the Persians and nature, but now he had to win the war against the base instincts and selfishness in the souls of his own men. It was the last and most difficult test, the test of freedom and the proximity of the goal, which almost destroyed everything they had fought so desperately for. After long ordeals and unsuccessful attempts to find ships, the army, maintaining a fragile unity, moved west along the coast towards Byzantium and the straits leading to the Aegean Sea. Here, the final and perhaps most humiliating circle of hell awaited them. In Thrace, on the very threshold of Greece, they became embroiled in local political intrigues. They were approached by an ambitious Thracian king, Seuthes, who was waging a war to unite the local tribes. He offered the Greeks what they desperately needed: payment for their military services. The tired and impoverished army, seeing this as their only chance to earn money for the journey home, agreed, and fell into a trap once again. The war in Thrace was completely different from what they were used to. It was a dirty, brutal guerrilla war, consisting of night raids on villages, looting, and massacres of civilians. The Greeks, the heroes of the Anabasis, were reduced to common enforcers in the service of a barbarian king. The army's morale hit rock bottom, but the worst was yet to come. When Suths, with the help of the Greeks, achieved his goals and regained his kingdom, he, like many before him, simply stiffed the mercenaries, refusing to pay them the agreed-upon sum. The army was once again left without money or provisions in a foreign and now hostile land. It was the height of irony and humiliation. The men who had defeated the army of the Persian king, crossed impassable mountains, and survived in an icy wasteland were now forced to beg and plead for their wages from a petty Thracian chieftain. This episode was a bitter lesson for them that the world is not divided into civilized Hellenes and savage barbarians. Treachery and deceit have no nationality. The Thracian adventure was the final chord in their odyssey, completely dispelling any remaining heroic aura and returning them to the harsh reality of mercenary life, where valor and honor are often just commodities that are not always paid for. The end of the Great March of the 10,000 was devoid of heroic pathos. There was no triumphant return to their native cities, no universal acclaim. The great army, that unique organism that had lived by its own laws, fought and survived as a single entity for nearly 2 years, ceased to exist quietly and prosaically. After Scythes' betrayal, the exhausted and disillusioned Greeks finally reached the Greek cities on the Hellespont, and here their fate made one last, ironic circle. At that very time, Sparta, the hegemon of Greece, was starting a new war in Asia Minor, again against Persia, against the very same satrap Tissaphernes who had so treacherously dealt with their first commanders. The Spartan generals urgently needed experienced veterans who knew the theater of operations. And then, the remnants of the 10,000, about 6,000 battle-hardened professionals, turned up. For them, it was the only way out. The Spartan commander Thybron offered them service and pay. The circle was complete. They had begun their journey as mercenaries in the service of a Persian prince to fight the Persian king, and they ended as mercenaries in the service of Sparta to once again fight the Persians. Their unique army, their marching republic, dissolved, merging into the Spartan army. Their shared history was over. Each of them received his pay and went his own way. Some, having saved up money, finally returned home. Others continued to fight until their death, and some, like Xenophon, found a new patron in the Spartans. The Great March, the epic odyssey of survival, ended just as it had begun, with a mercenary contract. But although the army as a single entity ceased to exist, its legend was just beginning. The physical body of the army had died, but its spirit, captured in the chronicles of its leader, was destined for immortality. For Xenophon himself, the return was the apex of a life's paradox. He, an Athenian to the core, a man who had led his army through thousands of kilometers of danger under the banner of Hellenic freedom and culture, could not return to his native city. While he was wandering through Asia, the political situation in Greece had changed. Relations between Athens and Sparta had soured once again. And Xenophon had not only served alongside Spartans in Cyrus's army, but had eventually entered the service of the Spartan king Agesilaus, becoming his close friend and advisor. For democratic Athens, the eternal rival of oligarchic Sparta, this was tantamount to high treason. By a decision of the popular assembly in his absence, Xenophon was condemned and sentenced to exile from Athens under penalty of death. Fate had played a cruel joke on him. The man who had become a symbol of returning home, Nostos, one of the central themes of Greek culture, was himself deprived of a home. The one who had preserved and saved a unique, marching democracy was exiled from his own democracy. The Spartans, however, appreciated his services and loyalty. They gave him a rich estate in Scylla, in Elis, near Olympia. Here, far from the political storms, Xenophon finally found peace and was able to devote himself to what he was perhaps born to do. He lived the life of a wealthy landowner, hunted, received guests, and, most importantly, wrote. The man who brought thousands of Greeks home found his own home, albeit not his native one, in exile, so that from there he could tell the world their shared story. In the tranquility of his estate in Scylla, far from the clash of swords and the cries of battle, Xenophon accomplished his greatest and most enduring feat. He took his campaign journals, his wax tablets inscribed at campfires, and turned them into a literary masterpiece, a book called Anabasis, which literally translates to the ascent, referring to the march into the interior of Asia, up from the sea. This work became something much more than just a military memoir. It was the first autobiographical work in history written with such a degree of detail and psychological depth. Xenophon, using all the talent honed in Socratic dialogues, transformed what was essentially a failed mercenary venture into a grand epic of the triumph of the human spirit. He wrote in a simple, clear, and energetic style, creating an effect of complete immersion. The reader journeys with the Greeks through all their trials, feeling the dust of Mesopotamia, the cold of the Armenian snows, the horror of betrayal, and the exultation at the sight of the sea. Modestly omitting his own decisive role in the first days after the catastrophe, and often speaking of himself in the third person, Xenophon nevertheless creates a convincing portrait of an ideal leader, intelligent, brave, prudent, and above all, capable of persuading with words. Anabasis became his true, undeniable victory. On the battlefield, they had suffered a strategic defeat, but on the pages of his book, this defeat was transformed into the greatest moral victory. Xenophon proved that the pen can indeed be mightier than the sword. The sword had saved their bodies, but his words saved their souls from oblivion, turning a group of obscure mercenaries into immortal heroes, and their desperate flight into one of the greatest adventures in human history. The legacy of the March of the 10,000, immortalized in Anabasis, extended far beyond literature and philosophy. Xenophon's book became not just popular reading, but a strategic document of colossal importance. It circulated throughout Greece, studied by generals, politicians, and anyone interested in military affairs, and the conclusions that could be drawn from it were staggering. First, Anabasis ruthlessly exposed the internal weakness of the Persian Empire. 10,000 Greeks, without support or supplies, had managed to fight their way through all its satrapies, winning every engagement and fending off huge armies. It became clear that the Persian colossus stood on feet of clay. Its army was numerous, but poorly trained and unmotivated. Its empire was torn by internal contradictions. The March of the 10,000 was, in essence, a great reconnaissance in force, which showed that the conquest of Persia was possible. Second, Xenophon's book became a detailed roadmap for a future conqueror. It contained priceless information about the geography of Asia Minor and Mesopotamia, about routes and distances, about the customs and traditions of dozens of tribes and peoples inhabiting the empire, and about their military tactics and vulnerabilities. It was a ready-made practical guide for an invasion, and the man who studied this guide most carefully did not take long to appear. 2 generations after Xenophon, a young and ambitious king of Macedon named Alexander, whose father Philip had already united Greece, began his own march to the east. His Anabasis was on a much grander scale and ended not in a retreat, but in the complete destruction of the Persian Empire, But it cannot be denied that it was the 10,000 Greeks and their chronicler Xenophon who paved the way for him. Their incredible retreat became the prologue to the great Hellenistic conquests that forever changed the map of the world. So how did he bring them home? How did Xenophon and his comrades manage to perform this miracle, turning total defeat into an unprecedented triumph of the spirit? The answer to this central question, embedded in the very essence of their story, cannot be simple. It is a fusion of several key factors, each of which was vitally important. The first and most fundamental factor was the undeniable military superiority of the Greek hoplite and the phalanx. Discipline, training, and quality weaponry made them virtually invincible in close combat against any Asian army. This was their foundation, their last line of defense. The second, and perhaps most unique factor, was the model of armed democracy, born in a moment of despair. By turning the army into a self-governing polis, where every soldier felt like a responsible citizen, Xenophon unleashed the colossal internal energy of the collective. This was no longer an army of slaves or mercenaries, but an army of free men fighting for their lives and their right to return. The third factor was a brilliant capacity for adaptation. The Greeks did not cling to outdated dogmas. Faced with a new threat, guerrilla warfare, and attrition tactics, they immediately transformed their military machine, creating light infantry, cavalry, and developing new marching tactics. They learned from their mistakes and grew stronger with every trial. And finally, at the very center of this storm, the connecting link for all these factors was the personality of Xenophon himself. He was not a born tactical genius like Alexander, or a stern warrior like the Spartans. His strength lay elsewhere. He was the embodiment of logos, of reason and the word. By the power of his intellect, he analyzed situations and found the right solutions. By the power of his rhetoric, he managed the hopes and despair of 10,000 men. By the power of his unbending will and personal example, he made them push forward when it seemed impossible to go on. Thus, the paradox of their history is resolved. Defeat became victory because they managed to completely redefine the very concept of victory. For them, victory was not the conquest of a kingdom, but the saving of their own lives and their return home. And in that war, they were the absolute victors. The story of the March of the 10,000, as told by Xenophon, has long transcended the bounds of a simple military chronicle. It has become one of the great archetypal myths of Western civilization, an eternal story of the journey home. Anabasis is not just a tale about soldiers. It is a universal metaphor for human existence. Every society, every individual, at some point in their life, finds themselves on the plain of Cunaxa, a point where old goals have collapsed, old leaders have betrayed them, and the path forward is foggy and fraught with danger. The story of Xenophon and his men provides an answer to the eternal question: what do you do when you are trapped, deep in hostile territory? Be it an empire, a life crisis, or the abyss of your own despair? And the answer is strikingly modern. First, accept reality and cast off false hopes. Second, self-organize, create a new order based on reason, trust, and shared responsibility. Third, be flexible and constantly adapt to changing conditions, not afraid to abandon old methods if they no longer work. And fourth, find in yourself, or in someone else, a leader who can, through the power of words and example, keep the fire of hope alive. The March of the 10,000 is a hymn to human resilience and the power of the collective spirit. It is proof that even a small group of people, united by a common goal and led by a rational leader, can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. It is a timeless reminder that the longest and hardest journey is the journey home, to oneself, and that this journey, with all its suffering and trials, often proves to be more important and valuable than the final destination itself. Xenophon's story leaves us with a profound and enduring thought. Even in the deepest darkness, man is capable of lighting the candle of reason and will and forging a path to the sea, to his own personal Thalata.